President Biden puts the brakes on a U.S. steel deal.
But it can't be harvesting our facilities and letting them slowly but surely over a period of time deteriorate so that they can then bring product in from their other facilities around the world and have access to our market.
What are the consequences?
Which is the worst of two evils? Do you allow U.S. Steel to fail, or do you allow it to stick around under foreign ownership?
Today is Friday, January 3rd, and this is The Issue from VOA.
I'm Scott Walterman.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lori London.
This isn't about Japan. This is about U.S. steelmaking and keeping one of the largest steel producers in the United States, an American-owned company.
U.S. President Joe Biden on Friday followed through on his pledge to block Nippon Steel's nearly $15 billion bid to purchase U.S. steel, citing concerns the deal could hurt national security. We get details now from Reuters correspondent Sierra Lee.
The move, long expected, cuts off a critical lifeline of capital for the beleaguered American business. U.S. Steel has said it would have to idle key mills without the nearly $3 billion in promised investment from the Japanese firm. The proposed tie-up faced high-level opposition from the powerful United Steelworkers Union, as well as politicians. Both Biden and his incoming successor, Donald Trump, have taken aim at it as they sought to woo union voters in the swing state of Pennsylvania, where U.S. Steel is headquartered. Trump and Biden both asserted the company should remain American-owned. U.S. Steel has previously said the deal's failure would put at risk thousands of jobs, and it might be forced to close some steel mills, an assertion the USW union called baseless threats and intimidation. Nippon paid a hefty premium to clinch the purchase of the number 2 U.S. steel producer in an auction in 2023. But the bid prompted a review of the deal by the Committee on Foreign Investment, which vets international acquisitions for national security risks. The committee passed the final decision to Biden. Japan is a key U.S. ally in the Indo-Pacific, where China's economic and military rise has raised concerns in Washington, along with threats from North Korea. Japan is also the top investor in the United States.
That was Reuters correspondent Sierra Lee.
So, Lori, this is a really big deal because, number one, there's a lot of emotion on both sides. And there's a lot at stake, both for the people who work at U.S. Steel and some people believe for the United States of America as well.
Right. I mean, it's very complicated. So let's try to understand this very complicated deal. Joining us to help us with that is Scott Laing, a professor at the School of Management, University at Buffalo.
Thank you so much for being able to take the time to join us to talk about this.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Tell us what happened. So Nippon Steel wants to buy U.S. Steel. What happened?
Well, it seems that the Biden administration finally said no more to the deal as of today, I believe. Nippon Steel offered quite a generous price to acquire U.S. Steel, well over the current stock trading price. I believe U.S. Steel is trading at about $30 per share, and Nippon Steel offered about $54, I believe, per share, so a significant premium over market price. But the Biden administration had concerns about national security issues and won't allow the acquisition to move forward, unfortunately.
So what is the main problem that the president sees? It's supposedly there are national security concerns, but what would they be?
That's a great question. And so when you guys reached out to me for this interview, I tried to do a lot of digging. I've been following this acquisition for a while now, and there's been this back and forth and this nebulous national security concern. And there was never any real substance to these claims that we were hearing from various administration officials. And so I suppose the logic, and I'm speculating slightly here because they haven't outright said the exact justification, is the fear of a foreign entity owning a major manufacturing component of the U.S. economy, right? And so if U.S. Steel is the current steel maker, there is some competition. If Nippon comes in and acquires them, do we really want a foreign nation, a foreign entity, having control over such an important resource such as steel in our country? Now, the concern that kind of should be mitigated a little bit with that is, all right, that could be a concern all else equal, right? If, U.S. Steel was able to still produce at this rate, even without Nippon Steel acquiring it, all right, sure. If wartime occurred, we would want to be able to easily leverage all of those steel manufacturing processes, repurpose them in an emergency situation. But the problem with objecting to the merger is, well, all right, U.S. Steel was kind of on a downward trajectory. It's going to probably not be really fiscally able to survive. So we have this opportunity for Nippon Steel to come in and acquire it, reinvest, keep the jobs, keep the plants alive, keep the steel being made. In fact, invest in it, get the processes and infrastructure more modern. Without that deal going through, we're going to see job loss. We're going to see factories slowly struggle to produce, slowly struggle to make revenues, slowly lose their ability to produce that steel. So even if there was a wartime situation or an emergency, the very act of blocking this suggests that U.S. Steel is not even going to be around to produce those goods that we so need, as the Biden administration is sort of claiming and proposing. So then becomes, which is the worst of two evils? Do you allow U.S. Steel to fail, or do you allow it to stick around under foreign ownership? Or maybe there's another situation where I think the Biden administration was hoping, and I think it's natural in the public eye, when you hear U.S. Steel, you think American steel. When you hear Nippon Steel, Japan, it's almost psychological that the average consumer or the average American wants U.S. Steel to be made by a U.S. company, a domestically owned business. And so what you run the risk of then is there was a second offer for U.S. Steel, and that was from Cleveland-Cliffs, a competing steel company that is domestic. They offered about, I think, $40 per share, maybe high 30s per share. And Nippon Steel obviously offered a significant higher premium. For U.S. Steel, they have a fiduciary obligation to go where the higher bid is. But okay, Biden administration wants it to be domestically owned. If Cleveland Cliffs, if Cleveland Cliffs goes through, acquires it for a significantly cheaper rate than Nippon was willing to pay, well, the question becomes, what's worse? Do you want a monopoly on U.S. Steel, which is what's going to occur if Cleveland Cliffs does go through with their offer? And they have no real incentive to stick to their original offer now that Nippon has been rejected. They're probably going to undercut their original offer a little bit. Or do you rather the competition, which in my economics courses, I always teach competition. Competition is good. It keeps prices low. It's good for the consumer. And even though it's a Japanese company, there is going to be competition then between Cleveland Cliffs, Nucor, the already in place U.S. Steel manufacturing companies. It's just you're competing against one foreign entity who, keep in mind, is an ally and a trading partner.
Well, let's unpack a little bit of that. I know the two American companies don't like each other. There's bad blood between them. That's one problem in the Cleveland deal. Number two, there are legitimate supply chain concerns because we're just coming out of the pandemic. Couldn't make cars in Detroit because we couldn't get chips that weren't made here anymore. So one of the arguments that I heard was Nippon Steel says over a course of time we're going to slow the production at U.S. Steel because the world market is down. They ramp down production there. Something disrupts the supply chain, like a pandemic. Mm-hmm. And then you can't get the steel in the United States for whatever you need it for.
I think that's a fair argument. I would counter argue that we saw during the pandemic, I can't recall if it was President Trump or President Biden or maybe possibly both of them. I believe they enacted one of the wartime clauses that they had the presidential power to enact. And they forced a lot of I know it's not automobile makers, but they forced a lot of factories in the United States to produce PPE equipment, right? The face masks, a lot of the sanitizer, the stuff that the hospitals needed. I would think that if there was a situation where the supply chain had a sudden shock that was exogenous, like a pandemic, that whoever is in charge of whatever administration would have the ability to effectively enact that wartime clause and say, hey, we need steel ramped up now. It's not as if Nippon Steel has moved all of the workers and all of the infrastructure and the factories to Japan. They're still in America. I think it would be not unrealistic to assume that they could, in a dire situation, kind of nationalize it temporarily, take control of the factories and produce the steel if there was a shock to that magnitude. I think that would be my counter argument. But the supply chain is an interesting concern and part of why U.S. Steel is struggling, especially with international competition. I was reading about how China is supplying really low quality steel and kind of artificially lowering the price point, which is further causing the strain at U.S. Steel because they can't compete at that low price point given the quality issues, which maybe Nippon Steel could figure out a solution to. But it seems that U.S. Steel is kind of fallen behind and isn't able to compete at the moment. But I'm not sure if I answered your question.
I'm wondering, is there a political component to this decision by President Biden? Although, he's almost out of office, so he doesn't have any stake in his political future with this. But do you think that there was something political in the decision?
I mean, I would speculate he has no stake for his political future, but he has stake for his political legacy. And so President Biden, all throughout his career as a senator, as a vice president, as a president, he's been incredibly pro-union, pro-labor rights. He does not want his legacy tarnished at the home stretch of his presidency, even with him resigning from office, to be anti-union in any way. He wants to support what the Steelworkers Union is doing. They do not want Nippon Steel to go through, and I think President Biden wants to stand by with one of these final stances that reflects his whole career.
And you're not wrong. You mentioned it earlier. There is that iconic U.S. Steel brand. I mean, I immediately thought, I always think of the movie The Godfather, where, they're in Cuba and he says, Michael, we're bigger than U.S. Steel,
Mm-hmm. I think there is something psychological about that inherently. And you're right. It is U.S. Steel. To say that it's going to become owned by Japan, it's going to be Nippon Steel, it's no longer going to be, this company that reflects American values. But unfortunately, if it's a company that needs saving, what's the lesser of two evils? Do we let this American standard, this American brand completely fall apart and vanish potentially, go bankrupt, have its pieces scrapped by other companies? Or do we allow an ally to save it, keep the legacy going? Who's to say that Nippon will keep it for decades? They might divest it again at some point, and after they've strengthened the infrastructure, made the improvements, made it a more appealing purchase for another American company, we could keep the name alive versus letting it, face an early demise if it's facing such dire straits.
Do they have any recourse?
Nippon?
Yeah.
Well, they've said that they're going to try and sue. Whether or not they'll be able to, how far they'll get is going to remain to be seen. I also know President Trump is inbound. I was reading how his, I believe, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is a consultant for Nippon Steel. So sure, there's a lot of lobbying going on behind the scenes. I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the union leadership and the union workers. And ultimately, this kind of ties back to your earlier question of, with President Biden and his political stake in the game. I mean, both presidents won their presidencies through the swing state of Pennsylvania. And these steelworkers are, I think, 18,000 voters that determine the presidency currently. And I think both Biden and Trump have reason to want to make those workers happy. The question becomes, again, do we let potentially, we say this is an American company, American brand, we're going to keep it American. But what if there's no buyers after Nippon? What if Cleveland gives a really bad offer? Do we really want to risk this company going completely under, losing 18,000 good union jobs? Nippon did promise they were going to keep the union jobs. So I don't know I think they're going to probably pursue recourse. I would imagine they're going to kind of work behind the scenes, though, and see if there's some way to still get across the finish line with the new administration coming in soon. But that's all speculation.
And he has said publicly that he, too, is opposed to the sale. Said it during the campaign. Scott, thanks so much for the time, the insight,
Yes, thank you so much for interviewing me. Yeah, love it.
Scott Laing is a professor at the University at Buffalo School of Management.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. It's hard to say, even after listening to all of that, which side is right.
I know. I was thinking the same thing. Like, both sides have some really strong arguments, and I can't imagine that it would be an easy decision for any president. But obviously, President Biden felt that that's what he needed to do, and apparently the incoming president may actually agree. So this fight clearly is probably going to be going into the new administration.
I think you're right. And I think the one thing that we can take away from this conversation is this story is not over. You've been listening to The Issue from the Voice of America.
On behalf of all of us here at VOA in Washington and across the globe, thanks so much for joining us.
You can follow The Issue on X, Blue Sky, and Facebook at VOA The Issue. And if you need news anytime, 24/7, go to our website, voanews.com.
In Washington, I'm Lori London.
And I'm Scott Walterman.
We will talk to you soon.